A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're getting into a conversation around living a life free of addiction to drugs and alcohol. Now, we don't always make the wisest decisions around drugs and alcohol in our younger years. And for those who are addicted, getting free can be one of the most difficult challenges in life. Real wisdom might be to equip our children, our teenagers, our young adults with the skills necessary to navigate the minefield of drugs and alcohol. Now, our special guest today is not afraid to promote the concept of abstinence from alcohol and drugs. As Christians, we can appreciate the wisdom of God in that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, or that we ought to not be drunk on wine, or that the fruit of the Spirit includes the concept of self-control. We might wonder that the narrative around drugs and alcohol doesn't always include the word abstinence as a way of preventing harm and promoting a flourishing life. Well, we're back with drug educator Shane Varcoe today. He's CEO at Dalgarno Institute, one of the 450-plus member organisations of the World Federation Against Drugs across 71 countries. Dalgarno's a health education charity, and Shane, well, he's been a long advocate for strengthening individuals' capacity to make healthy choices. And always a pleasure to have him back. Shane Varcoe, welcome back to 2020.
Thank you, Neil, and as always, a joy to be here. Love connecting with you and your listeners.
You know, we're going to talk abstinence from alcohol and drugs today, but let's start with a conversation we regularly have around harm minimisation and demand minimisation. Sometimes it's difficult to get your head around some of those, but there's been some dominant strategies that governments think about when they think about how you promote some healthy ways of looking at alcohol and drugs. Give us your insights here around harm minimisation and demand minimisation and where we might be in Australia right now.
Yeah, good question. I think for a backdrop for your listeners and those who are familiar with what we do and have heard us before, but perhaps it's a bit of a repeat. But basically the National Drug Strategy, which is due to be reviewed next year after a 10-year iteration in play, is called the Harm Minimisation National Drug Strategy. Now, harm minimisation has three pillars. This is really important. And I need to kind of explain this to your listeners so they get their head around these three key pillars. In this last iteration, 10 years, the primary pillar, the first priority pillar of this harm minimisation strategy was demand reduction. In other words, the priority was to be on prevention, primary prevention, reducing demand, reducing the likelihood or the promotion thereof substance use, either illegal or illegal, so tobacco, alcohol, illicit drugs. Next to that was the second to that was supply reduction. And those two go hand in hand, reducing supply so that people have a better chance to avoid uptake, deny uptake. And of course, the last one is harm reduction, which was always about, and it's an important pillar, was always about helping those caught in the tyranny of addiction stay alive whilst they exit substance use, whichever one they have. And that's a very important distinction. Now, what's happened, bad actors have got into the system, into the culture, and they've flipped it a bit, and the script is now an interchangeable word between harm minimisation and harm reduction. And harm reduction is now the parroted term. And harm reduction now, and it's not in its original intent, has become a tool by which drug use normalisation has been kind of fostered. And of course, in that context, demand reduction is waned. Supply reduction continues to be a problem because once you normalise substance use, then you increase demand. It's a fascinating phenomenon. Now, I could go down that rabbit hole a lot more in the policy frameworks, but just a quick one. You'll notice there's three major drug groups in the National Drug Strategy: tobacco, alcohol, and illicit drugs. The mantra around tobacco is simple. It's quit, stop, cessation, abstinence. It's the only message, one voice, one focus, one message in the marketplace. And all the major actors in the public square are on the same page. Health, government, media, education, all the same page. No one's saying, hey, yeah, Joy, light up here every now and then. Have have a safe smoking room, all this kind of stuff. When it comes to alcohol, they have shifted a bit, which is good. Now we have drink responsibly, be responsible, be aware, slow down, have periods of abstinence. But with illicit drugs, it's now become keep using, just don't die. So the cognitive dissonance and the current interpretation of the National Drug Strategy is creating all sorts of problems. And abstinence has been a casualty of that. And we want to bring that back to the table on an evidence-based platform.
There are researchers that work on these things, oftentimes associated with some of our great universities around Australia. I note that there's one Professor John Toomburu, I hope I've got his name pronounced right there, but he's been able to reflect on the changing status of the way that, when these sorts of pillars in the drug minimisation strategy, these things have happened since the 1980s, and so this word abstinence in the mix here, it's become popular and it's become less popular, and it sort of seems to come in and out of fashion. Any thoughts on the sort of timeline that the researchers come up with that show what might have happened already in Australia?
Yeah, it is interesting. Look, we've had a problem with alcohol, particularly in this country, for a long, long time. In fact, our organisation, the Dalgarno Institute, its current iteration is basically the latest version of one of the longest-standing charities in Australia, arguably one of the top 4 longest-running charities, Dalgarno Institute. It is, and of course, it has its roots going right back to the temperance movement, which was started when there was no government policy on substances. There was no alcohol particularly. It was a free-for-all. Tobacco was just a normal part of life. It was completely inculcated into culture. And so the only way you would actually deal with that is to have public offerings from the private sector coming to the front and saying, how do we need to challenge this? And the women were the key advocates for this, because they were suffering most horrendously from the misuse of alcohol. And of course, tobacco and its harms weren't fully understood back then. So it was kind of just part of the deal. And of course, with the cigarette company taking over and mass producing cigarettes and adding all sorts of substances and nicotine as well, it's another story. But bottom line was, we saw a pushback, and some serious pushback. And the idea of abstinence coming back on the table was then done 120, 130, 140 years ago. We had some wins, but then World War I came, there were some issues, and of course self-medication after, as you can imagine, after World War I, the vets. We actually had, just a side here, we actually had prohibition in Australia, almost a constitutional prohibition that on alcohol for returning vets. There were certain things you could not do. But then what happened in the sort of mid-50s and 60s, we started, after World War II, we started to move into this whole idea of liberalising alcohol again. And with that came all sorts of other issues. But what the fascinating thing is that in Victoria and other states as well, a gentleman by the name of Neuhausen, forgive me for mispronouncing his name, but he did this study of what was going on in Europe. And of course, Europe's nighttime economies were seen as a really great flourishing enterprise where people go have a meal, have a drink, and let's bring that to Australia. But what they were doing was translating a European, particularly a French model, where alcohol is more of a condiment, not a central ingredient, and transposing it onto an Anglo culture in Australia where we're binge culture, where alcohol was basically the central ingredient. And all of a sudden our nighttime economies came into this sort of free-for-all. So you go out, you're supposed to have a meal with your beer, where you drink or whatever it is, but you might have a handful of peanuts and just get blasted. And then we had a chaos during the 90s, and it was a mess. And then we had the Alco Pops in the early 2000s, and we had a drive at our organisation re-pushed for the drinking age to be re-raised to 21. It was lower than the 70s. To re-raise it, we got a lot of traction in the early 2000s on that. Didn't quite make the cut, but we got very close. And all of a sudden the government started saying, we need to wind this back. So again, abstinence is now coming back under the table, not just because it's a moral or a social issue. It is those things. But more importantly, it's a best health and mental health practice scenario, not just for the young, but for every age demographic. And that's what's important.
The trouble is, here in Australia, we have wonderful, long, hot summers. And, having a beer has become normal Aussie culture, reinforced by all of the marketing campaigns from alcohol companies, and mix that in. And I'm not sure, I'm across all of that, but, as you say, there is something about Aussies, different to the Europeans, this binge culture that we have here, and just being aware of that might actually be a way of actually, taking a little bit of caution around that with our own alcohol consumption and the way we think about that with our children. Binge culture and a long hot summer, those two don't easily mix, do they?
No, they don't. And I think that issue, it certainly was a key selling point, for want of a better word, for the industry. And Big Alcohol's great at marketing. They're exceptional at harnessing a cultural narrative, then coming in behind it, capturing it, and then selling it back to you as if this is the best thing ever. Like this is normal. This is right. This is Aussie. This is what we do. It's great, Yeah. And of course, we just reflect what we've been sold, and the feedback loop grows. But that's actually been shifting, Neil. And recently, the alcohol industry, and we'll talk about illicit substances a bit later, but the alcohol industry tried to tap into this new wave of health harms pushback from our sector, and then the public health sector are pushing back, saying, hey, look, there's a lot of harm being done here by alcohol. It's quite horrendous. In fact, it is tobacco and alcohol, still, because they are the legal drugs, very important distinction here, they do the most harms in our culture because they have the greatest permission model attached to them, legalised right to use. Anyway, but what happens is you've got this pushback from the abstinence saying, look, this is really bad. Health charities, government are starting to push back. So what does the industry do? It says, hey, we've come out with healthy beer offerings, low carb. Low carb beer is good for you. And the spin, and they also what they call pink marketing. So they feminise their products as well, so the ladies will engage. It's just outrageous. And Big Alcohol have also been lobbying with the World Health Organization, against the World Health Organization and other organizations, to actually push into that space and prevent legislative changes on an international level. And they've had some success because they've got a lot of money behind them. But what we're seeing, Neil, is people on, for example, now with pregnancy, mums, where once upon a time this was not on the radar, now it's high on the radar. FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, big issue. You've got dry in July, you've got October, you've got Febfast. These are all months that raise money for disease management, alcohol awareness, and staying abstinent. And so abstinence is a great, not just an interim measure, but it's a very positive measure. And people are starting to become aware of the harms of this substance. And so people are now choosing, and more, and even young people are choosing more and more. Some of the reasons they choose are not healthy, some are, but they choose to step away from alcohol because they do understand that binge culture is detrimental to them, particularly on many levels, not least the development of their brains, which is very important.
Some would jump to the conclusion that, well, why doesn't somebody just get in there and prohibit alcohol? But I think the history shows, doesn't it, that prohibition just does not work. It pushes alcohol underground. The temperance movement, it seems to have, given birth to the idea of wowzers, and when you're thinking of women marching down the street with signs, and of course all the best intentions there, because women were the ones suffering with alcoholic husbands, but the blue rinse set walking down the street, it's got a certain image to it, hasn't it? And that sort of wowzer tag seems to be something that, maybe we don't talk about it as much today, but as soon as you start to say, how about someone doing something about alcohol consumption, all of a sudden you're labelled a wowzer. Thoughts from you around that?
Yeah, look, I think that certainly was an old adage. Even 15, 20 years ago, that was still on the table. We counted that, but that's almost vanished now. That ignorance was, again, a meme. It was meme-esque. And just to be clear, just for the listeners who may not be aware, it's the women's, for example, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They were not the suffragettes, by the way. They were the ones who got the right for women to vote in the world in New Zealand, first time. So that's really important history here. They actually shut down pubs regularly with their marching up and down. They shut down these organisations. They shut down brothels. They also, which is a good thing, and then they also, and as much as they were mocked and maligned and blah, 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 they also were incredibly effective at petitioning. In fact, the Victorian government still has on record the single as I believe I can be corrected if I'm wrong, the single greatest petition ever submitted to the Victorian government was handwritten, done by the WCT around alcohol issues back nearly 100 years ago. And it was hundreds of thousands of signatures, not electronic. This is all gathered by hand. And the temperance movement was huge, and it brought social reform. And then, of course, the pushback is the wowsers. Now, here's something for your listeners. They may not be aware of this. Wowser, where does it come from? WOWSER. And it actually stands for, it's an acrostic. And it says, and it means we only want social evils rectified. And if that's what wowser means, well, I'm a wowser. And anyone who's socially minded, cares about their community is also a wowser. They want social evils rectified. And alcohol use and illicit substances are doing the single greatest harms to our community right now. And that's something that we need to push back. And this is where the abstinence conversation becomes very helpful.
This is 2020 with Neil Johnson, helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
A text from Karen who says, Shane, I just agree that advertising in New Zealand and USA, 75% of all the money behind advertising paid for by big pharmaceutical companies and agricultural, now I'm not sure what all that means, in their pocket, women commoditised. You mentioned the pink focus there, and you might have your own thoughts about some of those words from Karen, but women commoditised in all of this. Women oftentimes are on the receiving end of all sorts of manipulation. Any thoughts from you there?
Yeah, of course, pink washing, and she's referring to the pink washing. It's done by most brands now. The idea is to try and get the female cohort to embrace this, and when the big wine thing was happening in the last probably year, not the last 5 years, but prior to that, there's a huge issue around Mummy's Wine O'Clock, and there's actually wine brands called Mummy's Medicine, and literally brand names, and Wine O'Clock, and so the idea is let's get together the girls and have a drink, and turning this into a really again, empowering kind of thing. And pharmaceuticals have done it as well, of course, because they want to sell products. And it's quite it's sinister in one sense. That's why it's needed to do research. Of course, when it comes to pharmaceuticals, that's a different animal. When it comes to alcohol, tobacco, and illicit drugs, there is no health benefits for those at all. So how they spin that, it's about empowerment usually. And that's very, very disturbing because the harm's done to the biological units of male and female, which are different. The impact can be different on both, and the severities of those impacts can be different as well.
Okay, just knowing you are a target for companies to sell their products. Hey, taking calls 1-800-316-316. Let's hear from Colin in Warwick in Queensland. Hey, Colin, welcome along.
Yeah, good day, Neil. How are you?
Very good, Colin. We need to be quick here, coming up to the news. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Look, I just want to make some comments. I ran away from home when I was 10 and I started smoking cigarettes. And then I did come back home. But by the time I was 17 and a half, I was a drug addict, alcoholic. And I was that until I was 35 and I got saved and God went bang, bang, bang and took away those three addictions supernaturally. And I'm 62 now and I haven't looked back. He gave me a young wife, 3 beautiful kids. Now, what I want to say is that the government goes about everything the wrong way because when someone's addicted to either of those 3 things, it's near impossible to get off them unless you've got God on your side. And I remember when the government started giving out morphine instead of, the heroin. You can't replace one addiction with another addiction. It was just, ridiculous.
Colin, you've got a great story to tell, and I'm sure you take great pride in your ability to be able to tell that story, particularly within the hearing of some young people who might be trying to look for some ways to navigate the way forward here. Let's bring Shane in. Shane, as you're hearing Colin reflect on those things, what are your thoughts?
Oh, Colin, certainly the sector that I work in, we see this is very true. The supracultural, the spiritual, the encounter with God is a key element in transitioning people out. Yeah. In fact, it's one of the most powerful ways of doing it. Not always possible for people who don't know that space, but it is interesting. What you talked about was your early uptake. Nicotine and alcohol, they talk about cannabis being a gateway drug. Nicotine and alcohol for the young brain, particularly 14-year-olds, is incredibly dangerous. Nicotine is one of the most brain-arresting substances known to us. What it does is rewire the teenage brain very quickly, and it creates inability to delay gratification, poor impulse control. And once you step into that space and you add alcohol to that, then the escalation is clear. So, kudos to you, mate, and obviously the divine encounter has been a key in your life. But yeah, the uptake is the key. We don't want to see young people uptaking, at least before they're 21.
Colin, anything quickly further to add?
Well, just what he just said is so true. And if there is anyone out there listening that is struggling with any of those addictions, just get someone with you who can pray with you. That's the important thing.
Why don't we take a few more calls here, Shane? Melanie is on the line from Victoria. Hi, Melanie. Welcome along. Thanks for waiting so patiently.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to thank Shane and the Dalgarno group that have done this much research and spreading the information, and particularly also for Vision for having him on and being able to hear information like that. Just my husband and I, both growing up, consumed alcohol, had no sort of teaching space to make us aware of the dangers and what it was doing to our brain. But now, as parents, got 4 children, came to Christ 15 years ago, and just to hear how refreshing it is to have people promote just abstinence and self-control. It's just so encouraging. So thank you.
You know what? If you're hearing it on Vision, there's a good chance you're not hearing it very many other places. Wonderful to hear that compliment for our guest here, Melanie. As you're listening to that, that's encouragement for you, isn't it, Shane?
Oh, yeah, Melanie, thank you. I appreciate that. And every now and then we do have wonderful people like yourself that reflect something positive to us, which is great. Clearly, you can understand we're constantly in adversarial contexts, and the bad guys don't want to shut us down. But yeah, abstinence, it's not just it can be a spiritual thing, it can be a moral thing, but it is best. The thing is we've lost track of is abstinence is best practice for health and well-being on every metric. And not saying it's the only option. We're not saying that it should be, prohibition should be put in place, but it simply is that statement. Abstinence is the best practice on every health metric, on alcohol and or other drugs. So it's as simple as that. Thank you.
And Melanie, before I let you go, you've got your own family. How are you approaching these sorts of things with your kids?
So thankfully we homeschool, and so we have a lot of time to listen to Vision and a lot of the programs on Vision. And again, just having people who have done the science. It's truth, it's factual, it's informative, and for our children to intellectually understand, but also to be able to see, what we come across in society, and therefore be able to do, the comparison, not condemning people, but just saying, well, that is the pathway they've chosen. So. Yeah, thank you again to Vision for all the good programs they have on.
Well done, Melanie, and we might be thankful that Shane Varcoe is not sponsored by any big alcohol or drug company. Hey, Melanie, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation today. We're talking about that word abstinence in the mix. When we talk about alcohol and drugs, we are talking about parents who have children, or we're talking about people who might be in school organisations, who might be teaching young people, teenagers, and even into adult years. We're talking about, what might be happening in the school, in the church youth group, rather. Let's take another call. Shalina is in Queensland. Hello, Shalina. Welcome.
Hello there.
Hi, Shalina. It's Shalina, isn't it?
Yeah, Shalana, yeah.
Shalana. Okay, Shalana, thank you. What are your thoughts?
I have a few, actually. So I remember growing up, my dad was an alcoholic and my mum never drank. And I remember my brothers said that, and I was a lot younger than them, they mentioned, that my mum had said that when the law changed about the hours around alcohol service, so like pubs and hotels used to only be open 2 hours, then 4 hours, and then like 8, and then stay open till midnight throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s, and how that increased, obviously the consumption of alcohol for my father, and then that brought more violence into our home.
Yeah.
Wow. Yep. As a starting point there, and I think you said you had a few points, let's just bring Shane into here because, we're not often talking about the downside effects of over alcohol abuse here. But what are your thoughts here for Shalana?
Yeah, we have a strong position on this. My father and mother drink, and my whole family suffers from it. It is a shocking scenario, and illicit drugs are now eclipsing alcohol as one of the most destructive elements in the family life: intimate partner violence, familial violence, child neglect. In fact, there's 7 ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. 7 of them have 3 categories: neglect, abuse, and I can't remember the other one, but there's 7 factors, and substance use is one of those, and substance use affects the other 6. This is how devastating this is. And you're right, what happened in the 60s, we have in our organisation was around goes way back 130 years. I still have old documents here, 6 o'clock closing, keep it at 6 o'clock, keep it at 6 o'clock. It was defeated. Then it went to 9, then it went to 10, then it went to midnight. In the 90s and early 2000s, we had 5 a.m. Licenses. You can basically drink almost 24 hours a day. So we've got outlets, selling alcohol, and big box outlets, which are now the biggest problem. The big box outlets, your Dan Murphy's, your Liquorlands, all that, they are now causing the single biggest cause of domestic violence and harms in communities. It's not the local pub, because people don't need to go to the local pub anymore. They just order online, drive in, buy a box full, go home, get hammered, and everyone around them suffers for it. And I'm really sorry to hear that that's been your experience.
Shalana, you had some more points. What else would you like to add?
I could go on about that, but yeah, all those things you mentioned happened in our family and in my life. So I drank for 10 years, and but then similar to the first gentleman you spoke to, who I was saved at 32, and I don't drink at all anymore. And then another point I wanted to add was one of my brothers who was given alcohol by the older siblings and other people in the family when he was only 5, become a chronic alcoholic, and by the time he was 25 he was told he would die if he didn't stop drinking. And so after I was saved, my husband and I prayed for him for many years, and when he turned 50 he came and stayed with us, and he left. He was waiting for a place and he went and stayed, and we were praying for him, and we prayed specifically that alcohol would taste disgusting in his mouth. And he ended up getting a place of his own because he was living in our garage. And three weeks later, we knew that we hadn't seen him after he got that little flat, and we knew that he would be on a binge. And he rang us up and said, and it was about 3 weeks later, and he said, look, I poured Largies down the sink. And for my brother to do that was just amazing. He said it just tasted disgusting. I couldn't drink it, and he stopped drinking. And I think he maybe fell off the wagon once in, 15 years. But he stopped drinking, and we give that credit to God. That was the power of prayer, and I would agree that the only way to have significant change is with Jesus.
Shalana, what a wonderful testimony to be able to share, especially in the hearing of young people and of anyone who's really under the grip of alcohol. Just come back to this for a moment here, Shane, as you're hearing Shalana share that. And this is fairly simple, isn't it? I'm going to pray for you and that alcohol won't taste so good. The idea of the spiritual encounter, this is something that even the great counselling philosophers have acknowledged is actually very, very powerful in the life of a person who's suffering under these things. What are your reflections here for Shalana?
Sure, Shalana. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And what I want to do, and I want to answer that, and I think it's great, and we want to celebrate that recovery, that exit. That's fantastic. My concern here is preventing uptake. That's primarily. We want to see people who are caught in this get out. Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Wonderful. But the problems that arise is when we don't actually do the preventative stuff. We don't delay uptake, deny uptake for as long as possible. Your brother's experience as a 5-year-old, our resources are replete with this thing. The earlier you start with any substance, the greater risk of brain damage, of harm, of addiction. In fact, 98% of all addictions happen before the age of 30. And in fact, you exponentially increase your capacity to become dependent and addicted if you start under the age of 21 and the age of certainly 17. But anyway, I digress. But the importance here is we don't. I'm going to use a Billy Graham. Yeah, here's a Billy Graham story. He was one day his father said to him about alcohol, and he said, "Oh, look, should I drink or not drink? And his father gave him a beer, apparently, a beer or something. He said, okay, drink it. He said, oh, Dad, you sure? His dad was an abstainer. So he drank it, and he drank it, and he spat. He said, that's disgusting. He says, okay, son, now moving forward, you can say, have you ever tried alcohol? He said, yes, I have. And what do you think? It was disgusting. And I think if we can get that message into young people early on, rather than the situation where your brother was in, where he's lost so much of life, quality of life, done harm to himself and others, that's really important. But yeah, wonderful. And it's interesting you talk about the exiting from substance use. And clinically, there's been some interesting scenarios. The 12-step program, which you're all familiar with, the AA, NA, which was started by Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob. And one of those guys was a Christian, and one of them wasn't, but they understood the higher power principle. And 12 Steps celebrated their 90th birthday, I think, last month. And so it's quite an impressive thing. And a lot of people don't like it. A lot of revisionists are now going after 12-step programs. They have morphed into a non-spiritual space, which I think has become problematic, and that's why they're not working as well, because they've replaced the higher power with anything but God, which is fascinating. But again, that's the choice people make. It's about existential faith, and I won't go down that rabbit hole. But bottom line is Carl Jung. This is really interesting. Dr. Carl Jung, and I'm going to paraphrase here. So check this yourself. Do your own investigation. Dr. Carl Jung, who's arguably was the fourth school of psychotherapy, Viennese school of psychotherapy, although not officially labelled as such. So he's up there with Freud and Adler and Frankl, right? But he was counselling an alcoholic in one of his sessions for a number of months. And bottom line was this gentleman, and I won't name him here, but his gentleman was not getting any better. And again, paraphrasing, and it's in a letter form, Jung wrote this and sent it to the founders of AA. He said, mate, you're hopeless. His words are, you're hopeless. Nothing's going to fix you except a spiritual encounter. I bumped into people who have this spiritual encounter with what they call God, and it fixes them. And he didn't understand it, but that was his start of his journey into looking into the supracultural factors or the spiritual factors in people's lives, which, of course, anthropologically is part of all of our experience. And the modern Western culture tries to excise spirituality from the space, which is to their detriment. And they're starting to bring that back in now with positive psychology, moral psychology. They're starting to bring that spirituality back on the table, but they're redefining it. But bottom line is, you're correct. What happens is you see these encounters where people surrender their lives, finally surrender their lives, and the God of the Bible intervenes, delivers them, sets them free, and makes them whole. The question we want to pose and the argument we set forth is, so why don't we have that in play in the first place? That kind of mechanism to prevent the harm, not just fix the damage when it's done. And, of course, surrender is always about an act of the will. So we won't get in that rabbit hole. But the key here is we want to see young people and young communities and families flourish and thrive with beneficial action, which is a paper that we wrote, talks about beneficial action. And the beneficial action that comes from spiritual settings, like, Christian church, for example, are very, very effective at keeping people away from drugs, not just helping them get off drugs.
Shalana, I want to thank you so much for taking some time. I'm going to let you go because I've got another call to take too. But Shalana in Queensland, thank you so much for your call. 1-800 316 316. You can send us a text on 0447 488 316. Let's take another call. Jerusa is in Perth. Hello, Jerusa. Welcome along.
Good morning. Thank you.
Jerusa, what are your thoughts?
I was just going to ask you things. Talking about abstinence without self-control, it is impossible to abstain from anything, and we know that self-control is one of the 9 fruit of spirit. Now, in Philippians 1:9, maybe to 11, the Word of God gives 2 things to a man: intelligence and wisdom. When you have this, you become blameless and righteous. Practicing the instruction of God leads to the knowledge, the exposure to knowledge. So I feel like within this generation, we have the Bible that have all the instructions, the direction on what to do. What I do at this moment for my kids is pretty much to teach them the Word of God, and just tell them, give them that foundation. Because when you have that foundation and you have the Holy Spirit within you, it kind of reminds you, even you're able to, have a self-control, because now the Holy Spirit reminds you if you doing something wrong, maybe you're drinking or whatever, there's a self-control, around it to be able to help you to abstain. But if you don't have that within you, it's hard. And it's a different thing to have the knowledge of God and practicing it. So I feel like we're only able to do this if we practice it in our day-to-day life. And that is, at home, at school, at our jobs, everywhere we go, conversations with people, whatever, so many ways, we can talk about it, because now the government have laws.
Jerusa, you are making a very, very good point here. And, so many of us, when we think of the fruit of the Spirit, we rattle those off, love, joy, peace, and we go through the list. And you know what the last one? The last one is self-control, and it's one thing to be able to rattle through what the fruit of the Spirit are. It's another thing to unpack each of those. It might be that self-control, the last one, really is one of the most important fruits that will be displayed in a life. Any thoughts here from you around issues like this that Jerusa is raising, Shane?
Sure. I think, again, you're talking biblical caveats and prescriptions. I think they're very important. The difficulty is, and whilst I may concur with their wisdom in that, and it's great, some people just choose to decide that that's not applicable wisdom in the current era. So they embrace other ideas. And culture is a very interesting animal. And unfortunately, the culture where our kids are involved with, and what you're doing is brilliant, by the way, with your children, is you're giving them good solid wisdom, counsel and understanding at an early age, and give them the framework, but also helping them understand what the culture thinks and how it ticks is important, and how them to watch for the pitfalls and minefields. And of course, the sound mind and self-control you're talking about, that's always eroded by substances. Sound mind and self-control is sabotaged by substance use. And the earlier you do that to your body, the quicker the sabotage. And of course, rebellion, and I just want to talk about this, rebellion and experimentation are counterfeit expressions of what the designer, the creator of life, always intended, which was reward and exploration. We were built to experience the creator's best and explore the best practices and options, but the counterfeit comes in and goes, no, just rebel and experiment and see what happens. And unfortunately, the counterfeit always is attractive and gives it an immediate buzz, but it's ripple effect. It's that tastes sweet in the mouth, and it's like absolute bitter in your guts. So it's important to give them that the breadth of understanding. You don't have to go into all the ins and outs of alcohol and other drug use, but understanding that they are counterfeits and that they will sabotage, and not just to set up prohibitions, but understandings and wisdoms that they can navigate well in the culture they're in.
Well, Jerusa in Perth, thank you so much for your call. Time is short. There's been a bunch of texts that have come through too. There's Karen who said, now just clarify this once again. We only want social evil reversed. Is that that's the acronym there for Wowser?
We only want social evils rectified.
Rectified. Okay. So there you go, Wowzer. Karen. Okay, we only want social evils rectified.
And of course the argument is, and when people say you're a wowser, I said, well, we only want social evils rectified, don't you? And they go, so you don't want them rectified? No, I'm not saying that. I said, well, are you a wowser then? It's quite a fascinating conversation.
Hey, I picked up in my bit of research before our conversation today, something like 2/3 of Aussies think that Australia has a problem with alcohol. If you're denying that there's even a problem, then you're probably in trouble there, and maybe that's 1/3 of Aussies, 1 in 3, but 2/3 think that there is a problem. That means 2/3 are open to actually, some of the things we're talking about today. Any final reflection from you as time's run out here, but, for listeners, final reflection on where we're at in Australia.
Of course. Yeah, I think the abstinence voice message is coming to the table. That's one of the recent research that was deployed by Professor John Timbrew and others. And that's a paper in the International Journal for Mental Health and Addiction. It's a very, very important document. It's just one of many understandings of this. But, abstinence, again, I'm going to reiterate this again. It is not the only option. We're not arguing that, but it is best practice when it comes to substances, tobacco, alcohol, and other illicit substances. It is still the best practice for better health and well-being on every metric. Very, very important. And finally, with this, I think when it comes to, and this is what's happening, we're seeing young people step away from maybe alcohol and they're embracing, not all of it, some are embracing California sober, which I think cannabis is better or less dangerous than alcohol. It is not. I can tell you that on a whole bunch of other levels, it is much worse than alcohol, and alcohol's got its own set of shocking parameters that do harm as well, no argument there. But this is not a better option than cannabis. And of course, other illicit drugs are growing with people experimenting for hedonic reasons. And of course, the harm's being done in families is horrendous. And once families adopt an abstinence posture, those harms evaporate, or at least the very ferocity of those evaporate. So that's an important distinction.
Well, I think being loud and proud about your abstinence may be the best thing for your own children and for those groups within your community that are, in fact, looking at you and they're saying, well, what sort of a role model are you? Hey, wonderful getting your insights once again today, Shane Varcoe. That's why you are our go-to when it comes to issues around drugs and alcohol and, raising that whole issue about marijuana. Is that a better alternative? We've had some earlier conversations, and there'll be listeners who might want to search for some podcasts of conversations we've had around cannabis, the use of marijuana. Shane Varcoe is CEO at Dalgarno Institute. Now, you can go to that, and it's like the more official website, isn't it, Shane? dalgarnoinstitute.org.au. But you've got some other websites like nobrainer.org.au. You're able to subscribe there. You can get regular updates. Correct. These are appropriate articles that will be, they're pitched at younger people. Really, really great, entertaining even, but full of such wonderful good substance that you want to get those newsletters. You can also check YouTube. There's all sorts of things you've got up on YouTube. Just very quickly, on YouTube, if listeners go to YouTube, they're looking for Dalgarno Institute or No Brainer, what are they going to see there?
Yeah, we've got a number of different, we've got curricula, we've got all sorts of things. On our website, you can actually purchase curriculum, which is video, DVD-based or video-based. And the YouTube channel, we've also got World Resiliency Day, which has got its own YouTube channel. We've got the Unnecessary Harm podcast, which has got its own YouTube channel. All these videos have got, there's some reels, some shorts, some snapshots. But there's also curriculum and also long versions as well. So you can glean from those and use them. And in fact, one of the curriculums that is free to download and use, it's called the Humpty Dumpty Dilemma, a resiliency project. It's on nobrainer.org.au. You can download that. It's got PowerPoints and videos that go with them. And that's great for young adults, for late teens, 16 plus. Really effective at giving them understanding about the things we talked about.
Wonderful, and always, as listeners know, like to point them to where you can find effective, well-researched resources, and sometimes you've got to search a little bit harder to get those, but when your family is in the status of really being in need, you can go and find those resources. So nobrainer.org.au, check YouTube channel, dalgarnoinstitute.org.au. Shane, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and your heart with us once again today on 2020.
Absolute pleasure, Neil, as always, and thank you for the time.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.